Hello, and welcome to Space Cities, a show about astronomy, space exploration, and scientific phenomena. My name is Garret Moore. I'll be hosting, and our very esteemed guest, Michael Horn, is here with me, and we have a fascinating talk, and I'm hoping that you will stay and listen and be amazed. Thank you very much. Welcome, Michael.
Hi, Garret. Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
So, as the authorized American representative for the Billy Meier contacts, you have a lot of information that most people are going to want to hear some detail about. And let's know a little bit about you now. How did you come upon the Billy Meier information, and how did you become the spokesperson?
Well, I first found the information on the Billy Meier UFO case in 1979. I walked into a bookstore that was in Los Angeles, West Los Angeles area. It was called the Bodhi Tree. And as I entered there, on a low-lying table rack was a coffee table-sized book with the most amazing photograph on the cover of a UFO. And inside was, because I rushed to pick it up, there were these just stunningly clear photographs of what we call UFOs. And many years before that, they were calling flying saucers. So my first instinct was that I was looking at something authentic. It looked very real to me. And I was reading some of the text, and I said, gee, I've got to just get this book. Pardon me. So I bought the book and took it home and went through it page by page and looked at the photographs, and they had information about the analysis of these photographs and metal samples and sound recordings. And there was this bearded guy in Switzerland, a one-armed man named Billy Meier, and the investigation that was being conducted into his, claimed and alleged experiences and the evidence by Lieutenant Colonel Wendell Stevens, who was retired from the U.S. Air Force at that point. He had put together a team with two private investigators, Lee and Britt Elders. And Lee and Britt Elders had a company called Intercept. And this was an investigative company that worked for Fortune 500 companies, secured those telephone lines and safe rooms, and did counter-espionage type of work. And they were, pretty dedicated and somewhat skeptical about claims pertaining to UFOs and extraterrestrials. So when Wendell, who had been sent some of the early photographs and information on the Billy Meier case, was talking to them about going to Switzerland for this, they said, well, not so fast, Wendell, we're going to go with you because this is probably a hoax. So as we read more in this book, and subsequently when I got more information, which was about 7 years later, 1986, and from there on, getting texts, I learned about the information, about the evidence, about the investigation, about the investigators, about their experiences. And over time, I met them as well. I had probably knew Wendell Stevens over a period of about 20 years before he died. I knew Lee and Britt Elders for at least 20 years or so. And it kept drawing me more and more into this information, into the evidence. And over time, the focus for me shifted from the obvious, what I would call the eye candy, all the UFO evidence, into deeper levels of the content of the case.
And did Billy eventually give his blessing for you representing his material here? Or?
Oh, it wasn't so much of a blessing as an agreement. Okay. I first met him in year 2000. And for the first couple, actually up until 2004, I was going to Switzerland every year as part of my own participation, and speaking with him each year and getting to know him and vice versa. And I think it was in 2004 I asked to officially represent the case, and that meant that I would present the information as they published it, the way they were intending to have it disseminated to the world. At the same time, I would not be obligated to say everything's true and agree with it if I didn't know or didn't feel that, and that I could question things and feel free to say what I've ultimately said over all these years, according to the information in the case. certainly now, 36 years after I first found this case and started looking into it, I say things about the evidence and where I would say this is conclusive as far as I'm concerned. This would establish, a reasonable level of evidence to proof. And beyond that, people will have to determine for themselves. And some things I would say, well, this pertains to the far distant past, and this pertains to the as yet unarrived future. So I can't draw conclusions as to the accuracy, and nobody else can yet. We'll have to wait and see about which way these things go and what's revealed. And I can say at this point that I haven't found the case to have errors in it. The information, whenever there's something we can correlate, Meier turns out to be accurate. And that's why I often call it prophetically accurate, because he published this information certainly before I knew it and before most people knew it. Sometimes, in some cases, there had been theories from terrestrial scientists about something, but they were generally theoretical. He would always present something conclusively in the conversation or in the prophecies and the predictions. We would have the corroboration later after he's published it. Then some scientists would come out and say, well, we've now discovered thus and so, or we've proven this thing, or an event transpires, such as some of the current events that are going on in the world. So to say prophetically accurate means also that this man had no means, certainly no opportunity, and I've yet to discern any motive for being, the one to publish all this specific information, and it establishes a great foundation of credibility.
And Billy's a fascinating man, and I really want to get into some of the predictions, many of them that actually played out just as he had written, and he received, I guess. But tell us a little bit about Billy, because he has a long history of contact with this
Plejaren,
yeah. And so it's not like something that just came out of the blue. He was really deeply involved with this group before anybody else knew what was going on.
Sure. Well, this raises a couple, interesting and relevant points. He claims his first contacts actually began when he was 5 years old, as a boy, and that the first contact was telepathic. He heard an older man's voice speaking to him in his head, which was a little perplexing for him. Shortly thereafter, he would actually find himself playing outside rural Switzerland, going into the woods, as he would do frequently, but he went in farther where there was a clearing, and there's a pear-shaped craft standing on strut-like legs, and an elderly man standing in front of the craft in what appears to be a deep-sea diver's suit without a helmet. And he said the man looked to be about 90 years old or so, and he was very benevolent feeling, that he felt no threat from him. And that actually began this 11-year mentoring cycle, if you will, of his first contacts. Now, there was a parish priest, Father Zimmerman, who had been telepathically contacted also apparently by Svath, so that he would be, because he was receptive to this as well, and he would be Meier's terrestrial mentor and confidant, and reassuring him that this is fine, this is good, it isn't the work of the devil and all that. Because this was a little religious area where he was raised in, and here's the parish priest. But the parish priest, Father Zimmerman, also had a much more expanded consciousness, and he knew that in his own role as a mentor to the people in his community, he couldn't move too fast to bring them other levels of reality. But young Edward was already raring to go here, and he was having these very profound experiences. So you find that this leads to there's many things. We could take several hours to go through all the details, but it leads to his, at one point, entering into the French Foreign Legion as a teenager and learning how to use weapons and different things, and then determining for himself that this was not his calling in life. He didn't want to be a killer, and so he walked out across the desert, one of the very few people ever to survive it, leaving the French Foreign Legion. I think I'm going to cross the desert, what it was, Sahara or whatever. And he survived that, and he went back to Switzerland, and he felt he had some atoning to do for things that he had participated in or been accused of, and so he went back to Switzerland to kind of pay those dues. Shortly thereafter, by the time he's 16 or so, Svath is getting ready to leave and leave life as well, over 900 years of age, and turn over the mentoring of young Meier to a woman named Asket. So we'll back it up and say that Svath is said to be a member of the Plejaren race, falsely known to us as Pleiadians. There's no such thing because there's no life in the Pleiades.
That's right.
This was a little deliberate mechanism that actually took place so that it would self-identify people that make all sorts of claims, since Meier's come forward that they too are contactees and all the rest of this silly stuff. So Asket comes from an adjoining universe to ours, we're told. Again, something I can't prove. And she's in the Dal universe, is what they call their universe, and she's of the Timar race, and she takes over for the next 11 years. During that period of time, in her mentoring of Meier and in the travels that he will be going on, let's say terrestrial, under his own steam, to learn, to study the world's different religions, to work his way through the world, hitchhiking, going through ultimately about 42 countries and tens of thousands of miles hitchhiking. He will also be going with Asket on trips back in time, and all sorts of things that, we go, wait a minute, we can go into more detail or leave it to people to read this for themselves. It's freely available. You can go into in great depth. And that would last for 11 years. And during that period of time, towards the latter part of it, he also would be known as the Phantom in the Middle East. India, Turkey, West Pakistan would hire him to bring in serial killers and mass murderers, psychopaths who were threatening and attacking people. And it required someone with nerves of steel, an ability to very discreetly and specifically use firearms if necessary to disable people so they could be brought in for the authorities to handle. And he did that kind of work. And an amazing story. I mean, here you go from being a 5-year-old boy in a Swiss village, and you're having contacts supposedly with an extraterrestrial man, and then this woman is your mentor, and the next thing you know, you've been through the French Foreign Legion, and you're now working in the Middle East, bringing in sociopaths. A
bounty hunter, essentially.
Yeah, but without that kind of an implication to it. Sure. He was in the service, of these departments to bring in these dangerous antisocial people, and that was one of the things. And he worked many, many kinds of different jobs to, carry his own weight and pay his way through his experiences. And he studied 1964 or so. He was in an ashram in India, in Marauli, India, where actually he would take his first UFO photos that still survived of Asket's ships in the sky, and another couple interesting kinds of photographs. And these would actually be reported on in the Statesman, and a newspaper in India published to this day. And the reporter would describe in his article, we also have that freely available, looking at these photos, and we have the photos that he was looking at. Many of them survived. And of course, these photos were taken on what's called a 1940s Kodak bellows type camera. My father had one. It's not the type of camera you can pull off special effects. I mean, it's your thing folded out, and you take the photograph, as a photographer and all. Mm-hmm. So this was a primitive camera, but here you have pretty good photographs from 1964. In some cases, yes, you have clear photos of the discs of Asket's ship. In other cases, you've got 8 of the ships in the sky seen as light objects with a woman sitting in the foreground. There's a phenomenal photograph of Meier sitting cross-legged. Behind him, a spire from the ashram, and above him, floating in the sky, in this photograph, is a holographic cross generated by Asket, and it's hovering above Billy's head, and he's just sitting there. So it's a story that keeps unfolding in every direction with more and more amazing information.
All through this time, he's also becoming extremely knowledgeable of through the information coming from these extraterrestrials, the Plejaren. So at what point does he, or does he do this naturally, decide that he has to tell others or find a way to inform the world of what he knows?
Well, as early as 11 years of age, he publishes some of his first prophetic information about coming things like deadly ray-type weapons that would be developed, climate change and damage that would be occurring, environmental damage. 1948. Wow. In 1951, he's 14 years of age, and he foretells specifically unnatural man-made climate change and goes to describe the different phenomena that would increase in intensity and frequency in the coming time, warning the world that man-made contributions, if you will, negative contributions, are damaging, even mentions the ozone layer, talks about the dangers of atomic energy. This is 1951.
And these were subjects that were not polite discussion in cultures back then. And so he was probably kept at arm's length, you know, by most people, scientists and so on. But how did they treat him at that point, and what did they do when they heard this?
You have to remember, this is pre-internet, pre-digital time, so he wasn't just pushing a button like we do now and sending out information to the masses. He sent letters around to people. He would send letters to the, you know, world leaders in different countries and scientists and things, and basically they ignored it. They simply dismissed it and ignored it. Now, while some people may or may not have been, you know, impacted, they did not react. They didn't contact him for more information. And as he would write later, some of this information, of course, was given to him by either Sfath or Asket, but he also had developed the ability, with their assistance, to call forth prophetic information himself. And this is connected to who he is and to the idea of reincarnation, who this spirit or spirit form has animated in the past as a personality throughout a very lengthy history, other prophets, people we know as prophets, and we have to separate the idea that there's anything glorious, celebrity status, you know, in terms of being a prophet. It's basically a very thankless job. Had it been better received historically in our world, there wouldn't be a need for a seventh and final prophet for Earth. So there's Billy Meier.
Yeah, and as I remember, prophets will never be accepted in their own country,
in their own time.
So he was really going against the winds of civilization at that point. And he must have been aware of that, but felt internally that how important this was. And that's a testament to how important he perceived this information was. Now, a lot of the material that he sent out becomes part of the public record. So it seems to me that there's really solid proof that what he was being told and what he wrote about comes to pass. That's pretty fascinating information as far as truth goes.
Yes. Here's what happens. For instance, let's go to his 1958 letter to the European leaders and nations and all this stuff. He specified such things as that in the future there would, in 1958, so the future on from there, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Okay, maybe a guess. But in the same paragraph, the United States of America will have 2 wars with Iraq. The second war will be led by a president who's the son of a former president. He mentions this again in the same document. These will be called the Gulf Wars. I mean, this is highly specific, as was the specific mention of AIDS, a disease that would be coming to the world. He specified that we would carry portable telephones. We would use plastic credit cards to transact. He laundry listed so many things. He mentioned as early as 1951 as well that people would have both televisions, which were just becoming popular in the early 50s, and computers in their homes. And this would be interconnected electronically around the world. He's foretelling the internet at a time when a computer was something that was the size of a building, and that we're going to have these in our homes and all. Now, people can, and I should mention that in the same document, he foretells that because as a retribution, if you will, for the Christian Crusades, radical Islamic fundamentalism will spread irrepressible terror around the world. Now, people can say, oh, well, that you can't prove that paper doesn't exist anymore. And I say, that's right. That's right. So how are you going to establish that this man really published these things then? Well, we know when these things were certainly available in German, originally published, and or online. Now, this information that I just gave to you, pardon me, we can't prove that he wrote the AIDS thing before, but we look suddenly to this thing about, wait a minute, radical Islamic terrorism spreading across the world, where we're seeing this IS right now, ISIS, the Islamic State. We're seeing horrible stuff, and there's even current warnings from Meier about it, but let's go to that. Now, in 1958, this is claimed to have been written. This document is online, let's say, by about 2006 or so, in German by about 2002. Where is this radical Islamic terrorist threat worldwide at that time? It doesn't exist. When we go into this material, and we'll find more and more, the EU, he foretells it in the same document, biometric chipping. The US and the EU will conduct biometric chipping of every human being on Earth if we don't prevent it. So we go, wait a minute, that Islamic thing and the EU, and well, the EU has been around, but that Islamic terrorism thing, 1958, 2002, 2006, it wasn't happening. So what you'll see more and more of, and there's 162 statements in that letter alone, you're going to find, you're going to go, wait a minute, this thing just happened recently, and it didn't happen 2, 4, 6, 8, or 10 years ago, and it's in the same document with the other stuff. So if we get several examples like that where we go, look, these aren't lucky guesses, it's specific stuff, it takes everything else along with it, because you can corroborate through deductive reasoning this document was indeed written before these events happened. And then when you go into prophetic information from 1976, 81, and 87, foretelling Russia and China coming together against the West, Russian troop movements, the fall of France to Islam, France to Islam, and there have already been severe riots in France and horrible thing with the killing of the cartoonists and whatnot. And you go, wait a minute, and then you get to the 1987 document. It's known as the Enoch or Enoch prophecies. And you read a couple more specific things. In the future, the Russians are going to attack Scandinavia, Norway, Finland, Sweden. In the past year or so, we have found that Russian military movements and some responsive military movements from those 3 countries are already taking place. But there's more. In 1987, because this is mentioned as well in 81, in 1987, Meier says that the Russians are going to move their troops to a specific city, Arkhangelsk, from which they will launch these attacks against Scandinavia and ultimately, and this gets interesting, come into the American state of Alaska, attacking America and dragging Canada in due to something that happens. So wait a minute, let's go back to this Arkhangelsk thing. 2 years ago, the Russians moved their troops to Arkhangelsk. Right. This document has been online since 2006. That means that, let's say 2013, 7 years after we know that this dated from 1987 document. So we start to go, wait a minute, the same documents foretells the Ebola epidemic. That just happened, didn't it, relatively speaking, within the last year. Now, in this document, as I just alluded to it, Canada is dragged into the conflict between Russia and the US. 1987, 2006, there's nothing going on between Canada and Russia. But just within the past couple years, Canada started to contest Russia's claims at the Arctic about the mineral rights. In one of our films, Billy talks about it before it happens. We have that, him talking about that and predicting it. Well, wait a minute. So what else happens? Well, Canada goes ahead recently as well and makes an agreement with the Eastern European state of Georgia, which really ticks Russia off as well. So now we have Canada directly in conflict with Russia. And this is foretold in this document. Now, how does this now one-armed 78-year-old man, he's published these documents years and decades ago. How does he know that? And we're seeing it unfold. It's not a lucky guess anymore.
So how does he present this information? Is he telling people, I've been told? Is he telling them that I was given this information? He's not just acting as a prophet. There's a context for this information that he's giving at the same time.
Well, and in all of the above. In other words, yes, he is a prophet, and that, we'll get to that in a second a little more, but some of this information is given to him in conversation with the extraterrestrials, with the Plejaren. They will tell him about something. I'll diverge for a second. 1988, I think, there's a planetary alignment that he's on a craft with an extraterrestrial named Quetzal. And they're describing this planetary alignment. And we could look it up and know what it was astronomically. And Quetzal calls him over to this particular screen and tells him, well, you can look at things and change things by moving them around. And Billy is talking about, well, this is three-dimensional, and it's as if we're really... So he's describing 3D holographic touchscreen technology in 1988, and we're told he's a simple one-armed Swiss farmer. Now, we've got to start scratching our bald heads here and go, something's going on. So as you said, how does he do it? In some ways, this is a conversational thing where they're giving him information. He's asking questions, making comments. Other times they give him a document such as the predictions of Elijah and Jeremiah or the Hanok prophecies. And in other cases, such as in the 1948 info when he's 11, in 1951 when he's 14, and 1958 when he's 21, he is bringing forward prophetic information. Some of which he's been given, but some of which he has through his own abilities sourced and then published.
So it's possible he was trained, or somehow he was inherently prophetic himself, and his relationship to the Plejarens may have not have been an accident. Accident. It was more or less, something that was inevitable.
Highly deliberate and actually predetermined over a long, long period of time for this reason. Now, this is one of those, according to the information in the case, things where I'm going to state this, and there's nothing to believe here. I can't prove it. I'll give you the information. What we're told here is this. Reincarnation is a fact of life. It's not what we call the soul, which they say is a temporary construct around the solar plexus. It's really what we would refer to as the psyche. It encompasses our emotions, our personality, etc., etc. And this is a temporary construct in each life. The eternal part of us is the human spirit, which is said to be deep within the center of the brain. It's a tiny part piece of what they call the creation. This universe, the energy, the intelligence, and all things gives to each human being throughout the universe, and apparently we're not alone, a human spirit, which is destined to evolve over countless millions and millions and millions and billions of years.
Which may be actually the reason for our existence, is to evolve.
Just Billy Meier said we have a film we did in 2008 called The Silent Revolution of Truth. Just about the first thing it said, Billy says, the meaning of life is the evolution of consciousness. So yes, so Meier, it is said, is the seventh and final prophet for humankind. He is the personality that is enlivened by this ancient, ancient spirit that has previously 6 times incarnated in 6 other personalities, 5 of whose names are very familiar to us. Those names are Enoch, Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah. Then there's somebody called Emmanuel, Muhammad, and then Billy. Emmanuel, we're told in this case, is the actual name of the prophet whose name and identity was falsely changed to Jesus Christ, someone who never actually existed, for whom there is 0 real historical record, despite the fact that at the time he supposedly lived, there's some 60 historians in the area, and not one of them ever mentions Jesus Christ, the guy who's supposedly raising people from the dead and walking on water, but nobody talks about him then. It's all, you have to wait until hundreds of years after these events when a New Testament comes out and you suddenly hear about a guy. But you go back to the Old Testament, Isaiah 7:14, and his name shall be called Emmanuel. New Testament, Matthew 1:23, Jesus, and his name shall be called Emmanuel. And it slips through twice, at least once in each of these, it may be in there more times. And then they're saying that, oh my gosh, that's controversial enough, but Muhammad, a true prophet? Yes, they say, and the same thing happened as happened to all the previous, to Muhammad, the prophets. Their teaching, which was always the same spiritual teaching, was corrupted. It was changed. It was falsified, edited, redacted, and manipulated so that religions and cults would be formed around it to control people and their thinking and their behavior. And here we are today with now a number of religions coming head to head and dragging everybody else with them into major conflict.
Well, yeah, the brackets that may be religions of the world right now seem to be colliding, and we see that happening every day in the news. The spiritual aspect of his writings and his works and the information that he's receiving seems central to all the messages, and even though, and I want to get into the things that he's been talking about lately, or that you've been talking about lately, you know, with respect to earth changes that are happening. Is there a context that he wants, or that he would suggest, or that the Plejadians would suggest that we look at all this from? Because if there is life after death, if there are subsequent lives that we live, and he's got a long job record in some major books, how do we look at this, and what are we learning from this information? Because that seems to be the crux of everything, and that's why he's here. What would you say? Well, you probably know what he would say.
I only can tell you, I only know what I've deduced and what I understand myself. And I'm a student of this work like there are other people. I'm not the final word certainly on any of this, but I'll give you my answer. Think of this perhaps in three parts. In other words, first we get the eye candy, we get the UFOs. Meier's photographs, films, metal samples, sound recordings, these were originally analyzed, expert analysis, independent, back in the late 70s, early 80s, and they were deemed to be authentic. There was no models, they were irreproducible. The technology we had at the time, which he didn't have access to, couldn't duplicate his stuff. Controversy still raged. Within the past year or so, 3 more independent analyses of his most controversial UFO photos and films were conducted by a professor in South America, and one of them with a professor and a professional photographer from Japan. And they did very extensive reports in all 3 of these areas. And one of the things, of course, they found that this was authentic. Now, I was challenged by a professor of astronomy. Well, who's this Professor Zahi? I said, it's completely irrelevant. He said, well, what are you talking, how can that? I said, simple, because in this case, we're not now having to rely on experts. They also, these guys published the protocols, the tools that they used are right there. And here's the photographs that they analyzed, and you can do the same thing. To date, no skeptic has now rebutted these analyses. In fact, one of the photographs of the so-called wedding cake ship, a nighttime photo, you take it right off our website, a 35 millimeter photo, you drop it into Photoshop, and I'm really low tech, but I did this. You drop down the contrast and you boost the brightness, and suddenly you see this object isn't just a gold model against a black curtain, it's an actual object hovering over a road at nighttime. And there's a grassy area and there's a fence post. This 1981 35 millimeter camera, one-armed man, and there's 64 of these photos and a 5-minute video. Okay, so you get the eye candy, and the other physical evidence, such as the sound recordings, which I'll mention just briefly because this past weekend I was at a UFO expo in Santa Clara and had made a presentation, and a gentleman came up to the table I was at with my stuff, my DVDs and all that, and he introduced himself. His name is Nils Ragnerud. He was one of the original sound engineers who analyzed one of Meier's sound recordings of the beam ships, the UFO. And he authenticated. This is a sound aid. This isn't some kid sitting at home going, well, sounds to me like just a fishing line. You know, this guy, they scoped it. They did the whole thing. They had synthesizers. They said, we cannot duplicate these sounds, even with our synthesizers. Here are the patterns. Here's overtones indicating this and that. Okay, so this is the kind of stuff that was done decades ago and has now been redone, and the protocols are available to anybody to do it. So here you have the physical evidence, your eye candy, your ear candy, if you will. Then you go into the what we call the higher standard of proof, the prophecies and predictions, which also people are, I get now, thankfully, because I can't do it, people are sending me links all the time saying, did you know this just corroborated Meier's information? That corroborated, and they're sending me links from so-called new discoveries right now. And with the contact report, that is the numbered report in which Meier is discussing this information, and you're going, well, here it is, and we've got the publication dates, and now we have a so-called official discovery, new discovery, but we have it. This is how I really got into the Meier case in '88 when I was reading, I'll get back to it in a second, but that's how I got into the science stuff. So you've got this second category, this higher standard of proof, where anybody can start reasoning and deducing means, mode of opportunity. How could he have gotten around to all this stuff? He couldn't have, because we didn't know it either. Then you get to the core of the case, central to the case, as you said. That's the spiritual teaching. So the way it plays is, okay, we got, pardon me, we got your attention. Now we're telling you what's coming if you don't change direction, because everything in this universe operates according to the immutable law of causality, otherwise known to us as cause and effect. So every action has an equal and opposite reaction. It's laws of physics, right? The pendulum goes out, it comes back, it goes out. So if you don't want that thing coming back as a wrecking ball, right? You want to just kind of nudge that pendulum. For instance, that's the photograph of the wedding cake craft at night. When you drop it into Photoshop, it's not just a gold, quote-unquote, model. It's a real craft hovering over a road at night. You see the green grass right underneath. There's a little 3-foot or so fence post, and there's an energy field around it. According to the people who've analyzed the photo, they think those are energy fields. So you've moved to this understanding of one of the laws of, physics and creation, the law of cause and effect. And this is what will lead us into the deeper part of what is called the spiritual teaching, and how that is the remedy, the answer, the pathway for us to take control of our lives and to change these otherwise certain negative outcomes.
Right. The photoshopping and everything that now today is makes everything questionable didn't exist at the time that these photographs were taken, and that's one of the most amazing things that I found, is that the technology, and I went through college and I took photography and I was doing darkroom work, doing compositing and that type of thing. It not only is it not easy, without even the technology back in the 70s and the 60s, it was hard work, and this was a man that did not have fully functional physical abilities at the time.
Not only the functional physical abilities, he never purchased any darkroom equipment, because there's a record. When the investigators went to check this out, they found that he got all of his photographic equipment from a camera shop, I think it was called Bear Camera, and or Bear Photo, and he bought his 35mm camera and ultimately a film camera, ultimately got a video camera, but that was in '81. And he got these. He had a tripod and film. Did he buy chemicals? No, he never bought chemicals. Did he buy an enlarger or this or that? No. And he, of course, is living at home. He has a family, and there's people helping him at times. They come into his life. No, Billy's never had this equipment or anything. He sent all of his photos out for development, which is part of the reason that some of them were let's say, appropriated, manipulated, altered, and falsified. Yes,
sure.
and intelligence agencies and parties got a hold of this stuff, and they, manipulated. Before, you see, the stuff they managed to manipulate to cause questions with, primarily, well, what are called the Asket-Nera photos, or the photos of dinosaurs, or this, that, things that were able to be manipulated and falsified. They couldn't do that with these UFO photos. They're just too good and too clear. Yeah, you can, like Cal Korff can put some strings in there, right? And all, but Billy had, 1,200 plus photos survived, and there's a new book, 617 newly digitized, of his hundreds and hundreds of photos, and you're looking at this stuff, and now you can see the sunlight reflecting in the clouds and the sky and the trees and this and the shadows, and you're going, okay, wait a minute, 617 in this book, well, that's half of what he took. And with the films as well, there's one film where the ship is coming in, and you see two lights flash on and off, broad daylight. Mm-hmm. So we're supposed to believe that the one-armed Swiss fighter made a model that he could operate, and it put in two battery-operated lights, and with one hand he's filming and he's also 1976? Don't think so. So again, you've got this stunning physical evidence. Marcel Vogel analyzes the metal samples, these little squiggles, ingots of metal that are presented by Meier to the investigators for Vogel at IBM to analyze. And Vogel was a genius. People can read about him. And he said, I can't make these. I don't have the technology to do this. So you've got all this preponderance of high quality, evidence. Not somebody's claiming something, and not just there's a light in the sky. It's obviously an no, it's a light in the sky. And this is where we want to separate from this dreadful UFO community, UFO industry, UFO distraction, disinformation, that is a deliberate creation of intelligence agencies, some of which had tried to kill Meier in the 22 attempts on his life in 40 years, and that this stuff gets churned out and promoted uncritically. It's so easy to find all over the internet. Now there's ancient aliens and, UFO hunters and all the rest of this stuff. Billy Meier case, people don't hear about it. That is suppressed from the top down.
Yeah, there's a lot of I'm trying to remember the phrase that when you're presented with simple, clear evidence that you still don't accept it.
Occam's razor, the obvious answer being, the obvious answer being the right answer.
But you see people really doing things that are unconscionable with that information, misrepresenting it or otherwise. And as you know, I was an unwitting participant in somebody doing that. Before I knew Billy Meier or any of the story, I was illustrating a book that was debunking him, and I was told, well, what do you think? How do you think he would do that? And I did illustrations to represent that, just, because they hired me to do that.
Right.
Of course, I didn't know that they were going to use that in the book, and they ended up doing that. But I found them to be very, very questionable in their ethics, not returning my art and so on. So, but I'm sure a lot of information has been given that was constructed like that. That was really not true. And just because there's, when presented with evidence, there's nothing you can say. So a lot of these people will just say something else, and without any sense of ethics or any reasoning for representing truth. So he's dealing with a lot, and I've understood that over the years. Once I saw what he was dealing with, and I see him as a courageous spirit.
Oh my goodness!
In just surviving all that, because you see other people that are trying to tell you something and you don't believe it, and they get disappointed and they walk away. But he hasn't done that.
No, and we really, pardon me, have to stop for a moment, take a breath, and go, wait a minute. This whole UFO, alien, extraterrestrial thing has become commonplace. It's a source of entertainment, distraction, and amusement. But think about it for a moment, if we will. If there really are extraterrestrial human beings in some of these things we see in the sky, and indeed have made contact with one Earth person and continue it for 73 years, that is far and away the most important true story in all of science and human history. It's not just another topic for amusement. If that's true, and that's why it has been attacked and suppressed, because for human beings to know that, to realize that that evidence exists, the viewers of this show can determine this truth for themselves. That starts to change everything, and the powers that be certainly don't want to relinquish control. We understand how human beings work. That means the military, the religious, the political, the media, the corporate, all the vested interests do not want you and me, ladies and gentlemen of this world, children as well, to know we're not alone in this universe. There are far more advanced beings. They've had an interaction with even our forefathers going back thousands of years, and they're trying in some effective way to help us help ourselves. And it's why as early as 2004, I said the Billy Meier contacts, the key to our future survival. Can we start to take this seriously enough? Give this a half hour of your time and find out if what we're talking about here just might be true. And then you're going to go, why didn't somebody tell me? How come they didn't meet with our leaders and all this other stuff?
Just the implications of a truth like this go on forever.
Staggering.
And there are other people that are otherwise helping him. Can you tell me about FIGU, or
Sure.
The organization that's associated with this?
FIGU is a group of people who voluntarily have come, formed around Meier. They work voluntarily to help him disseminate his published material. And he's written over 50 books. There's well over 26,000 pages of information, most of which is still in German. Only maybe 5,000 or 6,000 pages are even in English at this point. All the stuff we're talking about, that's only what's in English. And that means that this vast body of material contains so much more we don't even know about. And Meier transcribes this at up to 100 words per minute or more with one hand in German. That is a stunning accomplishment. German, the nouns are all capitalized, and we have video, and in the films I've made, we show Meier doing some of this transcribing, and you see his hand flying across the screen. People think, well, maybe you've just sped up the camera, but the cute thing is, in his office, he always has a radio on. So you're seeing his hand going at super speed, but you're listening to music in real time, so you know it wasn't hoaxed and altered. It just goes on and on and on the more you probe.
Some of the information that's coming through Billy's writing and his contacts are quite earth-shaking, literally.
There's one in particular that makes it.
Before we run out of time, I wanted to cover some of this. Not only is there the warming and the other things that he predicted, but there are some more local events more directly associated with where we are and what we're doing.
Yes, with where we are. Well, along with the fact that he's predicted mega quakes and eruptions of volcanoes and things, and even parts of continents disappearing, islands going under because of rising sea levels and things like that. In 1978, in the kitchen in the center, which is his home, the investigative team and some of the Swiss were there, and he mentioned something about the San Francisco earthquake. And they said, "Do you mean the one from 1906? He said, "No, the one that's coming." And they said, "What on earth are you talking about?" Moment. And he went out of the room. He came back with a little familiar to older folks here, the yellow envelope with the photographs. And there were, I think, at least 11 photographs of San Francisco in a state of complete and utter destruction. Smoke, fires, cracked buildings, fallen structures, chaos. 11 photographs at least of this. And the lead investigator is looking, he's saying, these aren't paintings or anything, and not we're holding photographs. How did this, and Meier said, Quetzal took me forward in time. I think it was Quetzal at the time, if not Semyazi. And I photographed, because I wanted to take photographs of this quake, which is a prediction it's going to happen. And he said, what year? And he says, I'm not allowed to tell you. So they're going, now how do we figure this out? And Wendell said, I focused in on the cars on the street that I could see. He said the cars were rounder, more like the Beetle shape. Beetles were, the folks, VW Beetle was a much more familiar car in its early shape, distinguished from cars from the 70s, the big American cars. He says there's a lot more windshield, cars with larger windshields with the glass going into the roofline, rounder, didn't have the tail fins and all, and no external projections, meaning rear view mirrors, side view, rear view mirrors. Now, 1978, all the cars had, most of our cars today have them, but Toyota, Tesla, Mercedes, and some other car manufacturers, of course, many of these cars already have the internal camera for backing up, and the next step, they will drop the outside rear view mirrors. Many concept cars already show it.
That's going to conserve gas. It's less drag on the...
Less drag.
So it's a
And
natural.
you don't have to look outside the car. You'll have the screen in front of you, and you'll be seeing that, and we'll get used to that.
So Wendell, when he went into this information, did he look at buildings that were constructed that maybe weren't in the plans or existing today? And
and that weren't existing then. And from what I understand, because I didn't myself spent a lot of time on there was an illustration in Geo magazine that an artist had been impulsed apparently by some ETs to paint this, describe this, but Meier had not one, so-called painting or image. He had at least 11 photographs of it. Yeah, and so by even looking at the Geo magazine one, you might compare it to what exists now in San Francisco and what may come in the next couple of years, because we're looking probably at I'm guessing there's a window of something 5 to 7 years. I don't know. Nobody told me. I'm guessing, but that's one of the things. And then, of course, on the East Coast, Cumbre Vieja, I think it's called, or volcano in the Canary Islands is going to blow.
Really?
And unless the western-facing side is graded, 1 trillion tons of mass will be dumped into the ocean. Eastern seaboard will be swept. A lot of stuff here to think about.
Well, these are things that are probably inevitable. It sounds like. What would be the reason for telling us this, so that we could maybe avoid it ourselves?
Absolutely. I mean, Meier has said for decades, people need to move away from all coastlines. Easier said than done. I know people are, I don't want to move. Move away from coastlines, be at least 230 feet above sea level, because what's coming in the future, oceans, even rivers and lakes, are going to rise. Look, the sea levels are already rising anyhow, and once those tsunamis come in, such as the Northwest earthquake tsunami 9.0 that will run for 5 minutes, it's coming, the Cascadian subduction zone, it's a prediction. 3 years after Meier published that prediction, Oregon State University published the same prediction.
Well, taking all this into consideration, and maybe even believing that we have infinite lifetimes, and maybe that's a little comfort. But as far as these disasters, what does this say about mankind in general, where we're going, what potentials we may be missing in where we're at right now, and what do we need to know in order to go forward intelligently?
In order to go forward intelligently, we're encouraged, as we have been for some time, to look at the spiritual teaching. We have a foundation of credible physical evidence, prophetic evidence. Somebody knows something, and those somebody, or that somebody, or those somebodies are saying, we recommend and advise you to study this so that you may take control, charge of your destiny, your future, correct what still can be corrected, get your personal lives ironed out. And that means we have to have complete self-responsibility, self-honesty, observing and controlling our thoughts and our feelings. Sure, I can say these things in a few minutes, but this is a study, and it's a very rewarding study, because when you turn to something saying, I want to know the truth, as they say, the truth will set you free. The truth doesn't take prisoners. It sets them free. So if we're ready, and we may find, even if we think we're ready, once we start this process, the self-examination, the neutral positive observation and control of thinking, we're going to come up against those things inside ourselves which are not compatible with our best interest, with our truth, with love, peace, freedom, harmony. But we don't have to beat ourselves up. We have the teaching to guide us through that and to it. There are study groups, even up here in Northern California. There's a study group. Scott Baxter, Sloopy, people are, participating. Carter, different people are coming together to study in a leaderless environment where we are all students of something that helps us self-correct. We discuss, we contribute, we learn from each other's understanding. And this goes on where I live in Arizona. It's going on in Europe and in Japan and different places where people are saying, look, we don't want all this. My personal mission has been to prove the prophecies wrong. And the only way you do that is enough people, including oneself, wakes up and going, I need to course correct. Let's all do this and help each other. So this is no belief, no ritual, nothing to bow down to. There's no fearful you're not going to be dipped in boiling lead if you don't believe something. You don't have to pray to an omnipotent God that should have known enough to straighten your life out. Why are you praying? I mean, all the contradictions of belief systems are not present.
Yeah, well, I think that just being alive, the core is responsibility, and responsibility is learning awareness. I want you to say goodbye, and
okay.
we're so glad to have you. And please, for further information, contact Michael's information and Billy's at www.theyfly.com. That's THEYFLY.com. And hopefully people that have not otherwise looked at his material, please look at that more closely. For further information, contact Space Cities, P.O. Box 487, Mountain View, California, 94042. And next time, we hope that we can have somebody as just partially as interesting as you are.
Well,
because the material is ultimately important.
That's where the interest is, yes.
So thank you very much for being with us, and we'll see you next time.